O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, Word everywhere present and fill us all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one.
I'm joined again today by Michael Lofton, who is the host of the renowned YouTube show and podcast, Reason and Theology, where he discusses a wide variety of theological topics and contemporary issues in the church. He's currently working on a doctoral dissertation on the magisterium of the Catholic Church, and he's also the author of the recently published book, Answering Orthodoxy, which is out with Catholic Answers Press. Michael Lofton, welcome back to the Classical Theism Podcast.
Hey, John, thanks for having me back on.
So today we're going to be looking at a topic that you've talked a lot about in the past month and a half, and that is Fiducia Supplicans and the controversy surrounding it. And I've kind of organized our discussion in 12 questions. So I'm calling this answering 12 big questions about Fiducia Supplicans. And here's question number one. We're just going to dive right in.
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And thanks again for being here. This is really great. But what type of document is this? And how does it differ from other papal documents like apostolic exhortations? Also, and what does the title mean?
Right. Yeah. So when we look at the type of document that it is, and well, you mentioned apostolic exhortations, and what is the difference between that and what we have here? What we have here is a declaration issued by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so it's the highest document that this office, this Dicastery, can release. But the difference between it and, say, an apostolic exhortation is whenever the Pope issues something like an encyclical or apostolic constitution or apostolic exhortation, he teaches immediately. Whereas whenever he teaches through these dicasteries, we might speak of it being a more indirect way in which he teaches. Now, particularly in this case, there is papal approbation to the document, and that can be done either in what's called common form or specific form. Now, common form is going to be where the Pope just kind of approves the document, generally speaking, whereas specific form, he is approving the document in a very, very specific way and kind of making it his own. So there is a little bit of a difference there. In this particular case, if you look at the bottom of the document, he does have his signature there. So at the very least, it is approved in common form. And as far as what the document means, as far as its title, it just comes from the very beginning of the document, paragraph 1, which says the supplicating trust of the faithful people of God receives the gift of blessing, and so on. And so supplicating trust, Fiducia Supplicans, that's the name.
All right, very good. So here's a second question. Is this a magisterial document? You already talked about a couple of those distinctions between, it's mediated through the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith, as opposed to just issued by the Pope directly himself. Right. So people wonder, is it magisterial? And how can we know that, whether it's magisterial or not? And in what sense is it binding on the faithful?
Mm-hmm. So if this were going to impose some new law in the church, it would have to be approved in specific form according to the updates to the way these things work by Pope Francis himself. However, it does not update any kind of laws in the church, like no new laws or canons are impacted by this. Rather, it's more of a practical and disciplinary issue. And therefore common form is sufficient for it to be magisterial. And so when we see his signature at the bottom, where it notes that on the audience of the 18th of December of last year, the Pope received it, that makes it magisterial in common form. And you can see this if you go to that document of the Magisterium Donum Veritatis under Ratzinger. And this is an incredibly helpful resource, but it kind of explains the way some of these things work. If you look at paragraph 18, it notes this: the Roman pontiff fulfills his universal mission with the help of the various bodies of the Roman Curia, and in particular with that of the congregation, now dicastery, of the doctrine of the faith in matters of faith and morals. Consequently, the documents issued by this congregation, expressly approved by the Pope, participate in the ordinary magisterium of the successor of Peter. Now, you'll note it doesn't specify it has to be in specific form. It leaves it general. It could be either common form or specific form that he approves of it. Either way, as long as he expressly approves of it, which he did at the very bottom of the document, then it participates in his ordinary magisterium, what we might call non-definitive acts of the papal magisterium.
Okay. So now, since it's a non-definitive act of the papal magisterium, in what sense is it binding on the faithful?
Yeah. So if you go to the Profession of Faith of 1998 that Pope John Paul II promulgated, this is kind of what is binding on us. After professing the Nicene Creed, we affirm 3 paragraphs: one that affirms dogmas, the second that affirms what we call dogmatic facts, and then the third that affirms this other category of ordinary magisterial teachings or non-definitive acts of the magisterium. It says this: moreover, I adhere with religious submission of will and intellect to the teachings which either the Roman pontiff or the College of Bishops enunciate when they exercise their authentic magisterium, even if they do not intend to proclaim these teachings by a definitive act. So right there in our profession of faith, which is really at the core of our faith, we are bound to adhere with a submission of intellect and will to these non-definitive acts of the magisterium. And in that document that I just mentioned earlier, Dona Veritatis goes into that in more detail. There's also a great commentary by Cardinal Ratzinger and Bertone on the 3 paragraphs of the Profession of Faith, and especially that third paragraph that we just read, where Ratzinger goes into much more detail on this specific category of teachings that I highly recommend to everybody. It's called the Doctrinal Commentary on the Concluding Paragraphs of the Profession of Faith. That is just an incredibly helpful document, and it helps us understand better what our obligations are to this category of teaching. But in a nutshell, submission of intellect and will, which means I willfully conform my intellect to that proposition. I don't merely just kind of pass over it in silence, where I might not agree with it, but I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not going to say that I disagree with it. It's not this respectful silence. It's rather I am going to assent. I'm going to conform my intellect to what it proposes.
And I think it's also important to point out that it's a different conforming of the intellect than we have in the act of faith for things that are held dogmatically. Like you mentioned, those 3 paragraphs. We have things that are proposed as dogmas, as divinely revealed, that we cling to firmly on the authority of God and the fact that we believe him and everything that he reveals. And then we also have things that are taught definitively and infallibly by the church, which you also cleave to and hold to firmly. And as part of our noetic structure and act of faith as Catholics, we hold to those things in such a way that we know and we believe that they are not false and they cannot possibly be false. Whereas in these non-definitive sections, the type of way that we conform our intellect is we're assenting with it, we're going with it, we're receiving these things as true, but it doesn't necessarily bring about with it that firm, unwavering cleaving and adherence that is found to those teachings in first and second paragraph. We receive them as true. We affirm them. We're going with you, magisterium. We trust you. But we realize that there is at least a theoretical possibility that some of those things may not turn out to be true. Am I characterizing that fairly? And I'll link to the Professio Dei as well. But I think those first and second paragraphs, we distinguish the type of way that we try to conform ourselves to those from the third paragraph, but we are required to give at least some assent even to that third paragraph.
Yeah, that's spot on, because with the first paragraph, dogmatic teachings, you give that assent of faith because you know God has revealed it and the church has approved it. It has been revealed by God. Whereas in the category of what we're discussing, these non-definitive acts of the magisterium, the church has not necessarily proposed this as something that God has revealed. It is making a judgment, but it's not necessarily saying this is now a definitive judgment. So given the fact that it is still non-definitive in nature, we're assenting to it, but we realize, hey, it could be that the church could reverse this. It's very unlikely that the church will reverse it, but it could potentially do so because it has not taught it with the same kind of authority as a dogma, for instance.
All right. So this is the big question number 3. I know it's 12, but a little follow up here and there, add some clarification. So this is big question number 3. Since the document is authoritative in the way that you've explained, how should Catholics be disposed to it? And is there room in our disposition for what a lot of people have been sharing, dissatisfaction, confusion, discomfort, concern, or possibly even criticism of the prudence, timing, or phrasing of a document like Fiducia Supplicans?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. There's some important distinctions we have to make here. And I think these are distinctions that are missed on a lot of people. So they certainly should not be um, passed over here. When you speak of their dissatisfaction or confusion or discomfort or concerns, that's incredibly understandable. And the church does not necessarily say, hey, you can't do that. In fact, it leaves some room for that. If you go back to that document on the instruction on the ecclesial vocation of the theologian Dona Veritatis, it kind of gives you parameters on how to do that. If you have concerns, if you are confused, if you are dissatisfied, here's how you go about expressing that. Also, Canon 212 regulates this for us. It allows us to express some of our opinions. And here, the opinion would not be like a dissenting opinion, but rather a concern, confusion, dissatisfaction, discomfort, as you said it. It allows us to express that not only to our shepherds in private, but also publicly. So there is a bit of room here for us to be confused. That's understandable. Discomfort, sure. The problem, and by the way, I'll also even say, Dona Veritatis allows for constructive criticism publicly, not just privately, but publicly. Um, you could constructively critique a prudential act of the magisterium. Um, that is very different, however, than something like dissent and public dissent. So if you look at, again, Donum Veritatis, it's going to give room for everything we just covered. But then it has, I don't know, paragraphs 31 through 40, or I'm sorry, 32 through 41. It has a whole bunch of paragraphs against public dissent. So it distinguishes between concerns, even criticisms, versus dissent. Dissent is going to be, I reject this proposition. That's different than criticism. I can critique something without rejecting it. I can have discomfort without rejecting something. I can be confused without rejecting something. The document also says this: though we cannot publicly dissent from the magisterium or even privately dissent, it does allow in very rare circumstances for a well-trained theologian, after they've done due diligence and trying to conform their intellect and will to the teaching of the church, the proposition, if they still have remaining difficulties, it allows for them in rare cases to withhold assent of intellect and will. But there's a difference between withholding assent and publicly dissenting. There's a world of difference. Withholding assent is something that you can do privately without saying a word. Publicly dissenting, however, is in a public form expressing that you reject something. So there's a world of difference between the two. And these are distinctions most people don't make. So I'm glad you asked this question.
The first four or the first three big questions there have really kind of been setup questions and helping us make these distinctions. And now I think we're ready with those distinctions in mind to dive into the content of this document, Fiducia Supplicans. So it has like an introduction, which it calls presentation. And in the presentation, it uses the words, Cardinal Fernandez uses the words innovation and development to describe some contents of the document. I know, that has concerned some people. Given that, what is new about the teaching here?
Right. Let me read the paragraph in question that partly answers this. I'm also then going to read the press release that the Vatican issued, and I think it will answer the question. This is coming from the presentation section. As with the Holy Father's above mentioned response to the dubia of the two cardinals, this declaration remains firm on the traditional doctrine of the Church about marriage, not allowing any type of liturgical rite or blessing similar to a liturgical rite that can create confusion. The value of this document, however, is that it offers a specific and innovative, there's that word, innovative contribution to the pastoral meaning of blessings, permitting a broadening and enrichment of the classical understanding of blessings, which is closely linked to a liturgical perspective. Such theological reflection based on the pastoral vision of Pope Francis implies a real development from what has been said about blessings in the magisterium and the official text of the church. This explains why this text has taken on the typology of a declaration. All right, there's a lot going on there. But here's what he's saying. And this is confirmed again by the press release I'll read in just a moment. He's saying there are different kinds of blessings. We can speak of spontaneous blessings versus liturgical blessings. And what this document does is it distinguishes very clearly between the two. We've always intuitively known the difference, but the purpose of the magisterium is always to clarify and state things more explicitly. So this was already there. The document did not make this up, but it brings that distinction out more explicitly. And therefore, in that sense, it has developed the pastoral meaning of blessings. And in that sense, there's an innovation, not an innovation in doctrine, but rather in, again, the pastoral meaning of blessings. Now, here's what the press release said about this very section, bringing out the way I just explained it. Here's what Cardinal Fernandez says. The real novelty of this declaration, the one that requires a generous effort of reception, and from which no one should declare themselves excluded, is not the possibility of blessing couples in irregular situations. That's not the innovation. It is the invitation to distinguish between two different forms of blessings, liturgical or ritualized, and spontaneous and pastoral. The presentation clearly explains the value of this document is that it offers a specific innovative contribution to the pastoral meaning of blessings, permitting and broadening and enrichment of the classical understanding of blessings, which is closely linked to a liturgical perspective. This theological reflection based on the pastoral vision of Pope Francis implies a real development, and so on. And so again, he brings out the fact that the development is not in theology. It's actually not even in the possibility of blessing people in irregular unions. It's actually in the distinction between liturgical and pastoral, or liturgical and spontaneous blessings. Liturgical blessings are going to be those associated with the divine liturgy, or any other aspect of the liturgy, whereas spontaneous and pastoral blessings are going to be non-liturgical. They're not actually part of the liturgy. They're just a simple blessing. A person walks up to a priest on the street, "Father, can you bless me?" "Yeah, sure," bam, and they give them a blessing. That is what we're referring to. So again, this is a distinction that was already there. It's not like the document made it up, but it certainly brings it out more explicitly and articulates it for us.
So that's the innovation and development in the document, the emphasis on the different kinds of blessings. What traditional teachings, and you actually already alluded to this a little bit in the presentations, but what traditional teachings does the document explicitly reaffirm? Because I think some people have zoomed past that, and I want to get that on the table. Not only does it offer the innovation and development, it also does reaffirm some traditional teachings. So what are those?
Sure. Well, it reaffirms all teachings of the church. It doesn't deviate from any of them, but some of the ones that it does so explicitly and probably most notably is the fact that it notes again a marriage is between one man and one woman open to procreation, and it's very explicit about that. And it also reaffirms the fact that any sexual act outside of that context is morally illicit. In other words, it's sinful. It deviates from the will of God. And so it is very, very strong in upholding traditional marriage and that only sexual acts within that context and open to life. Um, so you'll notice there it's upholding humane vitae, right? Which is clearly it's a rejection of artificial contraception, right? It upholds that as well. And I think a lot of people have passed over that because of some of the controversies
Hmm.
involved. But those are just a few that come to mind.
No, those are good. And and people who are waiting, like, hey, DeRosa Lofton, you're doing all this setup, but I want to talk about the controversy. We're getting there. We're getting there. We're on question 6. We got 12 big questions here, and we are going to hit those controversies head on. But here's question 6, because a lot of people, Michael, who have expressed to me concern or confusion. It's actually not necessarily about the content of the document, but it's like why do we need this? I don't get why they had to put this out for the whole church right now when it seems
Mhm.
like they could have just let the 2021 document stand, and that's kind of it. And people are having trouble understanding the context, ecclesially and globally, or within the church, for this document. And so what I wanted to ask you is the next question, because you've talked about on your show that the German situation has something to do with this. And so I wanted to ask, what does the German synodal way have to do with this document? What's the relevance of talking about the German church when we look at Fiducia Supplicans?
Yeah, it's a good question and a legitimate one, and one I've heard many, many times. Why the document? Why not just go with what we had in 2021? Well, a couple of things. You'll recall that back in October there was a very large controversy that said Pope Francis is now going to open the door to blessing gay unions. There was a very large controversy saying this is coming. Just get ready for it. It's going to happen. And some were even suggesting Pope Francis has overturned that 2021 decision. And so Pope Francis actually did not overturn it. And it's certainly not the case that he was going to approve of blessing same sex unions. But there was this controversy saying he was going to, and it was all over secular media and Catholic media. So it was necessary to respond and restate that the 2021 declaration from the CDF, or now DDF, still holds, which the document did do, sneak peek. So that was one reason that I think a lot of people missed. It was necessary for him to come out and say, hey, no, 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 I have not backed away from 2021. Number two, and probably more importantly, the German bishops have been pushing for three things. And when I say German bishops, I don't mean all German bishops, but some of the German bishops have been pushing for three things: liturgical blessings for same sex unions, um, blessings for the unions themselves, not just the persons, and then also um, for the church to change its position on same-sex acts and to now affirm that the acts themselves are not disordered. In other words, that they're not sinful. Those are three notable things, among others, that the German bishops have been pushing for. And you'll note in this document, Pope Francis shoots down every one of those. No liturgical blessings, definitely no blessings for the union, that is the relationship. You can't bless in, and same-sex acts are still morally illicit. And again, it notes that when it notes that, again, anything that is outside of those sexual acts within a marriage open to life is morally illicit. So it just shot down everything that the German bishops were asking for. Third, um, I don't think people realize, but there really is a pastoral need for this document. And I don't think they appreciate that. And this document does address that pastoral need more than the 2021 document did. The 2021 document, if you go and read it, it still opened the door and left the door open for this document, Fiducia Supplicans. And so Fiducia Supplicans builds on the 2021 document and it meets a real pastoral need. What is that need? There are some people who are not ready to go to confession because they don't have a firm purpose of amendment yet. People who are struggling with same-sex acts, for instance. They're not ready because they don't have a firm purpose of amendment, but they also do want to be freed from their sin. It's that middle place that Augustine spoke of when he said, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. It was something along those lines, right? And I think we can all relate to this to some extent. We realize, gosh, I'm really struggling with this sin, but I certainly don't want God to approve of my sin. I'm not looking for validation of it, and I do want to be freed from it. But I'm really struggling with it, and I don't know if I'm fully ready to give it up. So I don't want it, but I'm also not fully ready to give it up. I think that everybody has struggled with that at some point in their life. And there are people in these situations who are currently struggling with that, and it's insensitive to say, well, they have confession. Okay, yeah, but that's the problem. They aren't there yet, but they are open to receive a simple blessing that will give them actual grace, as the document notes, and that will help dispose them further to come to repentance and a firm purpose of amendment. So it meets a real pastoral need to help people get them through that situation that they're in and to go to confession.
I think those are two important sources of framing for understanding where this document comes from. One, as a direct response to the German bishops and their proposals, and two, as meeting a real pastoral need. And I would invite people to consider those sources of framing for the document if you're someone who is concerned or confused or more prone to other framings, because a lot of people want to frame it in different ways. And when it comes to trying to articulate, like, what did the church intend with this? As faithful Catholics, let's try to take them at their word. And those are two very plausible instances. Cardinal Fernandez talks about he's going to have an important conversation with the Germans coming up. He said that in interviews. And so I think we should try to receive that as what the church intends for the framing and the context of this document. And it makes sense the way that you explain it. But having said that, people will still say, okay, DeRosa, even if the context is acceptable, I still have issues with the doctrine or with the teaching or with these apparent contradictions. So let's dive right into that. Here's the seventh big question. Much of the controversy with Fiducia Supplicans surrounds the climactic paragraph 31, which explains an allowance for the blessing of couples in irregular unions and the blessings for couples of the same sex. Yet, as you alluded to, the Vatican issued a document in 2021 that said, quote, God cannot bless sin, which seemed to rule out blessings for those who were in such relationships. And many have argued this is a direct contradiction between the documents. So even if I'm predisposed to be favorable to my prelates and to my shepherds, I can't affirm direct contradictions. So how do you navigate what's being taught here?
Well, I would point out that not only is there no contradiction here, that claim that God cannot bless sin is restated there in paragraph 5 when it notes that the church does not have the power to bless unions of persons of the same sex. And it's literally quoting that 2021 document. So the very part where that comes from, God cannot bless sin, and therefore the church does not have the power to bless unions of persons of the same sex, is restated there in 2023 in this Fiducia Supplicans document. So far from overturning it, it directly and explicitly reasserts it. And then elsewhere in the document, it notes again, any act outside of the procreative act within marriage between one man and one woman is morally illicit. So again, that's being restated there. So there is nothing in the document that says that the act itself is being validated. In fact, there's plenty of things saying, no, the act is not being validated. It's in the presentation section. You have it again expressed in paragraph 5, paragraph 11. I can think of other parts in the document as well that would resonate with that. And so, again, it nowhere validates the act, but it directs the blessings for persons for the precise reason to get away from these sinful acts. It actually notes that the whole purpose of the blessing is to help remove them from this context and situation so that they stop sinning and that they start following God and obeying his commands, and that anything that is disordered in their relationships is healed and is purified and is conformed then to God's commands.
Follow-up question number 8. Okay, we hear that, but some have said that since the document allows the blessings of couples as couples and not just several blessings for individuals, it's therefore allowing for the blessing of the disordered relationship. And some people have accused those of who try to distinguish between blessing a couple and blessing the union as engaging in sophistry or pedantic, inappropriate distinctions. So, how do you think about this part of it?
Let me first answer the sophistry part. I don't understand why anybody would think that. If we're just making very basic and legitimate distinctions, that's not sophistry. And if a person feels that that is sophistry, then good luck explaining the Trinity. Good luck explaining how the new covenant harmonizes with the old covenant. Good luck explaining Old Testament passages that speak about ordinance and statutes lasting forever, and they are in reference to animal sacrifices. Again, we're going to have to make important distinctions here whenever we come to those difficulties. Or Jesus, when Jesus says that, no one knows the day or the hour of his coming, not even the Son of Man. But hey, I thought Jesus was omniscient, right? Well, we're going to have to make some important distinctions here to explain that. So if making legitimate and important distinctions is sophistry, then I don't see how one could be a Christian. So I don't know how else to respond to it other than just point to that inconsistency. But let's get to the other part. You asked the question about blessing as a couple. I don't think that it indicates that. It's actually much more specific. Let's go to paragraph 31 and paragraph 38. There's plenty of other places we could go to, but I'll just summarize it here. Let's go to paragraph 31, where we see this notion of blessing for couples of the same sex. It says, within the horizon outlined here appears the possibility of blessings for couples in irregular situations and for couples of the same sex, the form of which should not be fixed ritually, so it can't be liturgical. In such cases, a blessing may be imparted that not only has an ascending value, but also involves an invocation of a blessing that descends from God upon those who. Now, notice the object here. It's upon those who. It's not upon a relationship. It's upon those who, which would be persons, recognizing themselves to be destitute and in need of his help. So these people recognize they're in sin and they need help. And they do not claim a legitimation of their own status. So they're not seeking validation of any sinful union. Rather, they're saying, Father, please bless us so that we are freed from sin. And it says, but who beg that all that is true, good, and humanly valid in their lives and their relationships be enriched, healed, and elevated in the presence of the Holy Spirit, which I know we're going to discuss later, so I'm going to table that one for just a second. These forms of blessings express a supplication that God may grant those aids that come from the impulses of his Spirit, what classical theology calls actual grace, so that they would receive grace, not approbation for their union, but as persons that they would receive grace so that human relationships may mature and grow in fidelity to the gospel, which would mean that they would be purified from sin, that they may be freed from their imperfections and frailties, and that they may express themselves in the ever-increasing dimension of the divine love. There's a lot going on there. But in the very context where we hear this notion of a blessing for couples of the same sex, it's not approbation. It's rather a supplication for divine aid to be freed from sin. And number two, it's not for the union itself. It's for the two persons within the union. When we speak of a couple, what is a couple? The document defines a couple, not as the relationship, but as two persons in a relationship. And you can further see this in paragraph 38, which says this. For this reason, one should neither provide for nor promote a ritual for the blessing of couples in an irregular situation. Now, notice it's talking about, again, couples here. At the same time, one should not prevent or prohibit their church's closeness to people in every situation. Notice it's talking about people in which they might seek God's help through a simple blessing, not validation, but help. And here's the money quote. In a brief prayer preceding the spontaneous blessing, the ordained minister could ask that the individuals have peace, health, and a spirit of patience, dialogue, mutual assistance, and fulfill God's will completely. Notice what it says, though. The prayer is for individuals, two individuals specifically, because again, what is a couple? A couple is two individuals in a relationship. The document over and over and over says we can't validate the relationship. We can't validate the union, but the persons in this disordered union, the couple, the two individuals, they can be an object of blessing.
I still remember listening. I think it was either day 2 or day 3 when you came out with a show that first explained that distinction between the persons of the couple and the union of the couple. And I think that is just the key that unlocks to how we should receive this. As you pointed out in paragraph 5, it is abundantly clear, and it says, the document Fiducia Supplicans, that the church does not have the power to impart blessings on unions of persons of the same sex. So then later on, when we hear about the blessing of couples, and you point about the blessing that descends upon those who, the persons, we are invited to make that distinction that the object of this blessing can be couples, can be two people in a same-sex relationship or in an irregular union. The object is the persons and the individuals. And then we'll talk about another distinction in a little bit, but that may lead to greater effects in their life, but it in no way involves a blessing of the union. And so some people, when they come back to me, Michael, I just wanted to add this one other point. And like, well, how do you explain that? How do you distinguish that? You know, if someone witnesses it, if they see it, they're going to say, oh, he's blessing the union. He's just blessing it just like he would a marriage. And it's no, they're not. One, obviously there's the duration of it being very short, but if you go and read what goes on at a liturgy for the sacrament of holy matrimony, and you read some of the blessings, which I've done, I'll try to link to some of them and just read the prayers that are said. The union and the relationship is constantly and explicitly invoked, spoken about positively, how the bond between these individuals should be strengthened. And it goes on for paragraphs and paragraphs to talk about those two people who are about to receive that sacrament. Whereas in these spontaneous blessings, the union is not, it's not at the forefront. It's not going to be even used in the language. It's not necessarily called to mind. Cardinal Fernandez points out the priest may not even know their exact relationship. This is a blessing for the persons. And if you're willing to allow that distinction, I do think the charges of contradiction simply fall away. Do you think that's helpful, or do you want to follow up on that?
Very, very, very helpful. Let me add 2 points because I think they're often overlooked. This is another thing from the presentation that further adds to what you were saying there. It says, it is precisely in this context that one can understand the possibility of blessing couples, there's that term again, in irregular situations in same-sex couples without officially validating their status or changing in any way the church's perennial teaching on marriage. It is explicit when we're referring to a blessing of the couple. It is not a validation of their status. And then, since you mentioned Fernandez there, he notes how these are just real simple blessings, 10, 15 seconds. He offers us an example of what this blessing may look like in the press release that the Vatican released. Listen to this. It says, in this case, the priest can recite a simple prayer like this. Lord, look at these children of yours. Grant them health, work, peace, and mutual help. Free them from everything that contradicts your gospel and allow them to live according to your will. Amen. And then it concludes with the sign of the cross on each of the two persons. And so it's abundantly clear there is no validation of the union. In fact, he's suggesting there actually needs to be language in there that kind of pricks them in the heart and says, let's pray that you be conformed to God's image and likeness and conform to his will.
I think that's a helpful follow-up. I'm going to throw a few more objections at you in our final section, but I just want to add an additional philosophical point to all that, because I do think some people have not necessarily explained this well. I think you've done a nice job with it. But when some people say, oh, couple, like literally just means two individuals without at all talking about their relationship, I don't think that's necessarily right. And I don't think we need to commit to that. I think what you said is correct. A couple refers to two people who are in a relationship. But one philosophical way I've explained this, Michael, is God has the power to bless the people without blessing their relationship. So the blessing of a couple goes to the two persons without validating their relationship. And if God has the power to do that, well, then he can empower his ministers to do so. So I would warn people who are defending the document, don't, get, tricked into saying you have to say a couple literally just means two individuals and has nothing to do with relationships. No. Couple can refer to two people who are in a relationship, but God can bless the people without blessing the relationship.
Yes, and one biblical precedent for that is God blessed the household of David, and it was a polygamous household.
Okay, number 9, though. If the document was so clear, why did Cardinal Fernandez have to issue a long clarification? Doesn't that prove that the document was insufficiently clear to begin with?
I think on the whole, it was pretty clear. Could they have done better in a few parts? Yeah, I think so. I do believe so. If they had sent this document to me and said, "Hey, Michael, what do you think about this?" before we promulgate it, I would have said, "Yeah, you know what? Take out the word couple, because I totally get what you're saying, but that's just going to unnecessarily confuse people, because they're not going to define couple by the way you define it in the document. They're going to import their definition into this word, and they're going to rip it out of context, and you're just going to see headlines that say blessings for couples of same sex, and people are going to get the wrong impression. Also, maybe change the word blessing in this context to just specifically supplication, because when people think of blessing, they think of God giving his approval, and that's one legitimate form, as the document notes, but there's also this supplication aspect. And so I would just say, you know what, avoid the term blessing and avoid the term couples. Say everything that you said. Say everything you said, just you don't use those words, because not that there's anything wrong with it, it would just help cut down on some unnecessary confusion. I don't think the document causes that confusion. I think what happens is, in the day and age we live in, a lot of journalists, especially in the secular media, they're not trained theologians. So they see this stuff. They're not going to read the document on its own terms and understand these words as they're defined in the document. They'll import their own meaning into them. And also, we just live in an age where people don't read the document, they just read headlines, and when they see blessings for same-sex couples, they'll import their definition into it. They won't read the document. Who's the fault? Who's the problem of the confusion there? I can't say the document is actually the source, because I have the exact same issue. We have the same issue with the Bible. There's plenty of things that the Bible says that in and of itself it's not confusing, but if you just kind of rip a verse out of context, it could be very misleading. I would say the source of the problem there isn't the Bible, and likewise here, it isn't the magisterial document. It's rather people and the way they read documents, social media, the way it works. So I would say the vast majority of the confusion was caused by either people of goodwill misunderstanding things but just not looking into the situation, or people of bad will trying to exploit this situation for their own agenda. That caused a tremendous amount of confusion. So yeah, Cardinal Fernandez needed to offer a response, but it's not because the document was so unclear. It's because the way that we, especially in Catholic media, portray this, we caused a massive amount of confusion. And so, yeah, he needed to respond. So that's my impression.
Yes, no, and several people have pointed out it's nothing new for the mainstream media to just get it totally wrong, like they did with Pope Benedict the 16th, and when he made his offhand comment about how a homosexual who chooses to use a condom is making is thinking about the morality and the law of gradualism and making a partial move towards taking responsibility for what they're doing. And this was like back in 2008 or 2009.
Yeah.
And then like all of a sudden the next day, the headlines are like, Pope approves of
Yeah.
contraception in all cases. It's like they don't even try. So the mainstream
Right.
media, they don't get it right. They don't even get close. However, it is unfortunate when it comes from Catholic sources, and they've not been necessarily willing to, make the distinctions to receive this document as true, like we're doing here. But still, I got to follow up with a few more questions, because here's number 10. Some have said this must be a bad document because bishops all over the world have rejected it, including almost the entire continent of Africa. What do you say to that?
In most of the cases that I've been told bishops have rejected it, when I go and actually read what they say, it's not a rejection. There are a few cases where some bishops have just straight up rejected it. But on the whole, most have not. And a lot of the ones that they say rejected it, they've rejected a caricature of the document, but not the document itself. That's the problem. And if we have a caricature in mind, and then we go and read a bishop rejecting the caricature, we might then think that that's a rejection of the document, but no, that's just a rejection of your straw man. A perfect example of that is the Nigerian bishops.
I was just thinking of that. And the Nigerian bishops is a great example. Yeah, tell them about it.
Perfect example, where they're embracing the document, where they're affirming, okay, yeah, you can have this blessing of persons in this relationship, but not the union itself. What's like, yeah, that's exactly what the document says. But again, a lot of people have thought that the document is validating the union. And so when they see an African bishop saying, no, I'm not going to bless the union, they think, oh, that's a rejection of the document. No, it's just a rejection of your straw man. So that's often what is going on. Now, in particular with the African bishops, there is an added layer where not only there is some of this misinformation going on, but many of the African bishops have said it's not applicable to their territory. And that is not because they reject the theology, but rather there are some laws in their country that this would contradict. And the Pope and Cardinal Fernandez have looked at the situation with the African bishops and said, yes, you're right. In some cases, it may not apply in certain territories, such as in Africa. Now, we all have to be on board with the theology in the document. Africa can't reject that, and to my knowledge, they aren't. But the application of it, yes, it is for each pastor in their diocese to determine how much it can or cannot apply in their territory given practical considerations. Another example is an Eastern Catholic bishop came out and said, hey, this doesn't apply. Now, you have other Eastern Catholic bishops who says it does apply to their territory, and some have said it doesn't apply. But that doesn't mean it's a rejection of the document. They're often just saying it doesn't apply because of some of these practical considerations.
And I think if people want a little bit more on that, Cardinal Fernandez's clarification goes into some of those details very specifically on the application. But all right, we're nearing the end, Michael. Two more big questions. 11 says this, and this is important because some are arguing that the document is saying priests can bless the good things in a disordered relationship without legitimizing the bad things. And they say that's not a proper argument in moral theology. Is that how you're taking this? In other words, do you think these are blessings that are designed to bless the good of a relationship while ignoring the bad?
So the way I read this document is in continuity with the 2021 document, because it expressly notes that it's in continuity with it. And now, if you go to the 2021 document from the CDF, it has a portion in there where it addresses this issue. And it says, though you may have some good found in these disordered unions, such as a same-sex relationship. And what is it referring to? It's obviously not referring to the acts, right? No, the act of, same-sex acts, that is not what it's referring to when it says it's good. It's thinking more of, well, people who are usually in these unions they also have a friendship, and sometimes they do good things, like when one is sick, the other person takes care of them, and those might be good things, right? But the document notes, though you may have some of these good things in these relationships, the good cannot be the object of blessing because these goods are found in a context of a disordered union. So that's what the 2021 document says. This good cannot be the object of the blessing. Now, when I read paragraph 31 of Fiducia Supplicans, I could see where some people might get tripped up and think that it's overturning that. But in fact, it's not. Paragraph 31 is in harmony with what the 2021 document is saying, because I'll just make this distinction. When you look at paragraph 31, and we can read that relevant portion again here in just a second, the object of the blessing is the persons, not the union. The object of the blessing isn't even any good found in that relationship. The object of the blessing is the persons. But there is an effect on the good found in that relationship, such as a friendship. There is some effect on that friendship. So here there's an important distinction. The blessing, the object of the blessing is not the good. So that's consistent with 2021, but there is an effect on it. So again, that's still consistent with what the church has previously said. So I don't think that there's a reversal here. And let's go to that relevant portion. It
Sure.
says in paragraph 31, in such cases, a blessing may be imparted that not only has an ascending value, but also involves an invocation of a blessing that descends from God upon those who. And again, I have to stress that because, again, the object here is those who, that is persons. And again, remember paragraph 38, it talks about the blessing is for individuals. It's for persons. All throughout the document, the object is persons. And those who, recognizing themselves to be destitute and in need of his help, do not claim a legitimation of their own status, but who beg that all that is true, good, and humanly valid in their lives. These people are asking, hey, anything that is good in my life and my relationship be enriched. Anything that's good here, such as a friendship, clearly not the same-sex acts, but anything that is good here, such as a friendship, we beg that those good things are enriched, but also healed. That's important. It says healed, because those friendships that they have, though they may have some good there, it needs to be healed, because it simply needs to be a relationship of friendship only. They don't need to be acting on any same-sex attraction. When they do that, they are sinning against each other. And that's an aspect of that friendship that needs to be healed. Get rid of all sin between the two of you, and have what's called in Catholic doctrine a holy friendship that is purely chaste. But it says that it's enriched, healed, and elevated by the presence of the Holy Spirit. These forms of blessings express a supplication that God may grant those aids that come from the impulses of his Spirit, what classical theology calls actual grace, so that human relationships, such as a friendship, may mature and grow in fidelity to the gospel, and that they may be freed from their imperfections and frailties, and that they may express themselves in the ever-increasing dimension of the divine love. So again, to summarize, the object here is the persons, but there is an effect on anything good found there. But the object is not the good.
Well, Michael Lofton, you've made it to the end here. Question number 12 of our answering 12 big questions about Fiducia Supplicans. And it has to do with you, because I don't know if you're aware, Michael Lofton, but you've got some critics out there, some critics of yours. And some people have accused you of being overly harsh towards your own critics, whether it's in comment sections or on your commentaries. And they say you're too quick to say that people are on the side of demons or that they're dissenting against the magisterium. And I was curious what kind of distinctions you would make here, because isn't there some room for Catholics who just want to be faithful, yet have those concerns or confusion?
If I've ever been too quick to do that and wrongfully or misjudge somebody, I do apologize. I don't want to. That's certainly not my intention. And there's definitely room for concern and criticism. There's room for understanding why people might be confused. I'm sympathetic to that. I get that. I understand that. I don't have really any qualms with somebody who's genuinely just concerned or confused, but they're of goodwill. I get it. my comments that I've made were not directed at them. Rather, my comments are directed at the people that Pope Francis has said are doing the work of the devil, to use his words. Those are his words. my comments are directed at them. People who are in a position to know better and might even know better in some cases, but are influencing many people down, with bad material down the wrong path and leading souls to destruction. So they're in a position of influence and they're leading souls to eternal damnation. That's my concern. And I want to say, for those people that Pope Francis is referring to when he says they do the work of the devil, yes, I do think that they are, again, doing the work of demons in some cases, whether they know it or not. I don't, that's a different question if they know that they're doing something wrong. But I'll give you a biblical precedent for it. Those who crucified Christ, St. Peter says, you did this in ignorance. He actually tells them, and they were pierced to the heart, and they're like, brothers, what do we do? But he says, hey, you did this in ignorance, but you still need to repent of it. And it's still a wicked and evil thing because you crucified the Son of God. Now, here you have people who did something horrible, but they didn't know it. They didn't know, they thought that they were doing the right thing. Okay, so even if we're talking about people who they don't know that they're doing wrong, there are situations where they are doing the work of the devil. And I stand with Pope Francis when he says that. Again, I'm not referring to people who just have concerns or constructive criticism, or they're just confused, not talking about them. And I would just say there's more biblical precedent for that language. Jesus used that language. St. Paul used that language. And St. Paul says, be imitators of me. And we're also to be imitators of Jesus. Now, obviously, we need to exercise prudence. And if I've failed in any particular situation and misjudged somebody, I do honestly apologize for that.
Well, Michael Lofton, we really appreciate you joining us here to explain this document and answer some of the questions and concerns people have surrounding Fiducia Supplicans. Obviously, we're going to point people toward Reason and Theology, where they can get a lot more of your content. Originally, we were going to talk about your book, Answering Orthodoxy, when I first had an idea for a show. But since you have really been the main guy on this document recently, I wanted to bring you on and answer that first. But I still hope to do another show in the future promoting that new apologetics book of yours. And please remind the listeners, where can they go to find out more about your stuff before we say goodbye?
Yeah, just go to YouTube, type in Reason and Theology, and you'll see the show.
Fantastic. Well, I'll link to that. I'm going to link to a bunch of the stuff that we talked about and some of the documents and things in the show notes page. But thanks again for joining us today. It's been a blast.
Thank you so much. Hey, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and especially the subscribe button so I can continue to grow this channel and reach more people with the content that you appreciate and enjoy. Also, check me out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology to get access to extra content and to support me. And also check out the GoFundMe link that is there in the show notes. That will help me continue to grow this channel and to keep the lights on, if you will. And at the very least, please support me with your prayers. God bless. Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy. It engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.